Dear viewer, you are listening to Totes Rad, a podcast where we read, discuss, and dissect banned books. I am one of your three hosts for this podcast, DaPurpleSharpie, and I am joined by composer and person who possesses the literal memory of a goldfish, Gemma Anderson. How are you doing today, Gemma?
Wait, I forgot. What are we doing here again?
I'm also joined by a game developer and diversity, equity, and inclusion, otherwise known as DEI hire, Jazz Pomegranate. Jazz, what's your latest day of employment in DEI been like?
Crashing planes.
Okay. In this two-part episode, we're dissecting Chapter 4 of White Rage by Carol Anderson, titled Rolling Back Civil Rights. This is part 1. This episode is very detailed, and it starts off with concepts that I think a lot of listeners will understand overwhelmingly, especially if they are not white individuals. We start off by talking about two specific presidents, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. These presidents are wheelhouses inside of the Conservative Party. They are elephants inside of a bunch of rhinos, and they are lauded as some of the best. In fact, Ronald Reagan, I believe, is one of the most well and looked upon fondest figures inside of the Conservative Party to date, right? It feels like every single conservative presidential candidate has really leaned into the idea of being another Ronald Reagan ever since Ronald Reagan. And you saw a lot of it in 2016, specifically during that presidential election, when we saw the very first Republican presidential election actually taking place at a Ronald Reagan location where everyone's like, I love Ronald Reagan's so great, But inside of this chapter, we see Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan for what the effects of their presidency did to the Black community. There's actually a specific quote that I want to read that Dr. Anderson provides inside of here that I feel actively showcases exactly what much of both the Reagan administration and Nixon administration managed to do when it came specifically to the concept of racism. Dr. Anderson writes, "The whittling down of racism to sheet-wearing goons allowed a cloud of racial innocence to cover many whites who, although, quote, resentful of Black progress, end quote, and determined to ensure that racial inequity remained untouched, could see and project themselves as the, quote, kind of upstanding white citizens, end quote, who were, quote, positively outraged at the tactics of the Ku Klux Klan, end quote. With the focus on the Klan, helped to design racism as an individual aberration, rather than something systemic, institutional, and pervasive." So Jazz and Gemma, I have to ask, what does that translate to in today's age, specifically like the whittling down of racism and the watering down of anti-Blackness? What does that look like in 2025? We go to Jazz first.
Sharpie, I really liked how you pointed out at the beginning that the kinds of racism that we're faced with in this chapter are things that members of our audience who are Black will be pretty aware of, largely because this is a chapter about the birth of the racism that we live in right now. So when we talk about reducing racism to the Klan or reducing racism to coloreds only signs, it was a process that had to take place over a couple of decades, essentially, between Nixon and Reagan, to really iron out these kinks of this new sort of streamlined approach where people could take offense at ways in which Black people responded to racism without ever really acknowledging any of the historical processes or political decisions that led to that. So the chapter talks a little bit about the riots that took place in the 1960s in Watts and Detroit and in other places. Those riots have a lot to do with the inequality that the Black community in those cities was dealing with. But as the Nixon campaign ads sort of showed, all that America saw, much like in 2020, all that many Americans saw was burning cities. So I think that there's definitely parallels, analogs, and echoes, even to this day.
Very, very poignant there, Jazz. Gemma, I want to ask you, I think it's very, very correct that there were time periods of both Black anger, white fear, and the taking of advantage of those two specific things for political gain. Obviously, this didn't go without noticing, especially since it seemed to be noticeable enough that Dr. Anderson was able to write a book about it over 30 some odd years later. So I have to ask, how does Dr. Anderson talk about communities and organizations reacting to this movement and this political monetization of white fear?
Yeah, Dr. Anderson really talks about how the NAACP not started, but continued to mobilize in this time period. However, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about how the evangelical church also was mobilizing, specifically the white evangelical church. You have a lot of people who are starting to flock to the church for answers to why are these people who I personally see as inferior allowed to sit next to me in this location, allowed to have the same things I have. And the religious right starts to really take hold in the mind of people. This group that gets trained to fervently crusade against causes. They are anti-abortion, anti-immigration, and as we will later see in the modern era, anti-LGBTQIA+.
So Jazz, how did different communities and organizations react to the political deployment of white fear?
I think that one of the things that we see in this era is a growing disillusionment with the way that civil rights had progressed up to that point. In many ways, Black people did, quote unquote, all of the right things, got arrested, got hosed down, marched, went to the courts, those sorts of things. The legal protections that they won were almost immediately attacked, attempted at stripping back, all those sorts of things. In this time period, we see a new articulation of a vision of Black liberation that is somewhat more rooted in ideas of Black power and Black nationalism, as we can see in the Black Panther Party. And as these demands become more, for lack of a better word, violent, but I don't mean in the sense that, these are violent people who are doing bad things, but rather, well, if the legal recourse is not available to us, what other recourse is there? As riots rock cities, even in the North, from Cleveland, Detroit, and Newark, this more robust, direct, and forceful articulation of a need for Black liberation starts to awaken in other people some very uncomfortable feelings. Many Northern white people, as George Wallace pointed out, started to feel in many ways like Southerners when he was running for president and was trying to block the admission of an African-American student to the university in Tuscaloosa. He received a lot of mail telling him that they stood by him, that they didn't think that this Black person should be admitted. And even a U.S. senator who asked to remain anonymous said that, quote, "I'm getting mail from white people saying, wait a minute, we've got some rights too," end quote. And I think that feeling of discomfort, it comes from a couple of places. Obviously, there's that sort of sense that, Black people are inferior and why do they get so much stuff? But I think sort of more deeply and somewhat more psychologically uncomfortable to look at are the ways in which Black people as a revolutionary population in the Marxist sense really bear out all of the other problems with our capitalist system. So that when Black people demand rights and white people say, well, I don't have that, they really sort of should be getting mad at the system which also denies what sort of they are due. But unfortunately, as we see in this chapter, so many conservative politicians have been incredibly effective at turning what should be a general rage of the working class to collectively gain more power against our rulers. They are able to sort of do like this judo, where rather than the whole working class rising up to better their whole lot, well, some pieces of the working class have some, and other pieces of the working class don't have some. And when those people who don't have some start getting some, then the people who have some but don't have it all are like, well, I don't want them to have any. It turns it into a zero-sum thing, and a lot of resentment gets thrown at Black people for asking for too much when it's really asking what everyone's due.
So I'm really happy that you touched on the class aspect of it, because for one of the very first times inside of this specific book, actually, I would say for the second time inside of this book's specific history, we actually talk about how overwhelmingly something that was done with the intention of hurting a non-Black race, specifically the Hispanic race, was also very clearly seen as an attempt at hurting overwhelmingly the Black populace. The first was obviously back a few chapters ago when I believe we quoted specifically the idea of affirmative action, as it was noted. But inside of this chapter, we actually talk about how the two Supreme Court justices that Richard Nixon put onto the Supreme Court actually helped detooth Brown even further. There were 3 court cases that accomplished this overwhelmingly. The first was 1973 San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez, in which that Supreme Court, with a very narrow majority, stated the Equal Protection Clause does not require absolute equality or precisely equal advantages, which was very, very strange to tell a Hispanic parent who is literally trying to say, hey, by the way, there's no chance of our kid getting a fair chance at having schooling here because schooling is determined by property taxes. The secondary case, 1974, which was a Black mother by the name of Vera Bradley against several different district figures inside of the state of Michigan, including the governor, William Milken. And that decision actually allowed the Supreme Court to kind of rewrite Brown into saying that Brown does not require any particular racial balance in each school, grade, or classroom. And finally, the killing blow came in 1978 when the decision from Regents of the University of California versus Alan Baca basically admitted that Alan Baca's argument of the university's policy admitting 16 Black and Latinos in a class of 100, denying him a white man equal protection under the law. It changed something for Brown. It made it significantly harder for Brown versus Board of Education be used as precedents inside of the United States of America. So my first topic that I want to get into around this was that each of one of these decisions was made with a very, very narrow majority. Gemma, what does this tell us about the presidential power over the Supreme Court?
One of the things that we touched on in a previous episode was how important it was that the FDR-stacked courts allowed us to even pass many of these civil rights acts in the first place. And now you're watching the flip side of it happen. All of a sudden, you have a very conservative, very anti-civil rights motivated Supreme Court panel. Nixon ended up, I believe, appointing 4 justices by the end of his, in totality. Yeah. And those 4 justices were absolutely instrumental. You see, I believe it has the vote counts for most of the votes in these chapters, but you see one of the votes in particular, 4-1 to 4. Alan Baca vote was 4-1 to 4. Those justices effectively put the nails in the coffin to bury civil rights. So often we like to think that the civil rights movement ended with the March on Washington. And that's what we're taught in school. That's where the unit cuts off. But yet you're seeing that after the march and in our day-to-day lives, we are still witnessing the repeal. We are still witnessing the repeal of civil rights. And that's a pain to watch and live through.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of brings me to a secondary question here. And Jazz, maybe you can expand on it. 2016 was obviously an election year, but President Trump was able to appoint 3 different justices to the Supreme Court. What does that say about our future if we're looking at our past?
Unfortunately, very bleak things. And we've already started to see that bear out in some of our more recent Supreme Court seasons.
I also think that the Supreme Court decisions allow us to see the voices of dissent. Specifically, Thurgood Marshall was very, very vocal on his dissents overwhelmingly inside of these issues. And the dissent that stood out the most to me was his comment on District versus Rodriguez, where he specifically notes the discrimination in terms of class affecting overwhelmingly lower income people. It's a show of not exclusively racial discrimination, or it's a show of not exclusively racial solidarity, but also class solidarity. Which brings me a secondary question for you here, Jazz. How important is solidarity when it comes to racial discrimination?
Well, gosh, Sharpie, it's the most important thing.
Is it really?
Oh, absolutely.
Why?
Quite simply put, there's more of us than there are of them. Once we realize that the differences between us are much smaller than the differences between us and those who dictate the day-to-day of our lives.
The final topic of the first half of this chapter is really poignant, because if these 2 previous topics didn't convince you, dear listener, that this topic is talking about 2025, this next topic will. The previous 2 topics and the previous entirety of this chapter focused on what Richard Nixon did. But this next topic is one of the very first looks we get at Ronald Reagan and his contribution, specifically through the mass layoffs in the federal government. He raised unemployment and overwhelmingly raised Black unemployment by cutting the Department of Health and Human Services by almost 3,000 layoffs in 1982. And he also appointed inadequate, inept, and biased leadership, like the 8th chairman of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and current Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. You know, there's a quote inside of here that Dr. Anderson provides. This is a quote of just her. It's not even a quote of a specific other historical figure. This is a quote of her own measure, in which she states, quote, "What Presidential Reagan loathed was the great society that, despite its dispersal of benefits to middle-class whites and its measurable effectiveness in lifting the elder out of poverty, he succeeded in coding as a giveaway program for Blacks." So now, of course, I have to ask, with Ronald Reagan's cuts and federal positions, defunding of different public social plans that the United States was implementing at a federal level to different states, and appointing, quote, inadequate, inept, and biased, end quote, leadership to certain watchdog locations. Are there any similarities to present day 2025? Gemma, we start with you.
You know, it's funny, actually. I have many friends who work within the federal government. And one of the conversations that I hear constantly around me is, I want everything to be okay. I love my job. I love working for my country. But I'm not going to risk losing my job and losing the place I can help people of all standings within this country. And unfortunately, for whatever department they're calling themselves now, these people are very much ready to stand up and say, no, you cannot do this. I'm going to help the people that my country entrusted me with the power to help.
We got federal employees standing that line right now.
It's happening all over across so many different agencies, so many different departments. Mm-hmm. And those people, not just the air quotes DEI hires, but literally The people who have been tenured for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, those people have said, no, I am very good at helping people. I am very good at making sure this country can function. We're seeing planes crash. Air traffic, all-time mess right now. It wasn't even this bad after 9/11. And yet, some organization comes in, decides that these people don't actually need to be working. We don't need these people to make this run smoothly. Well, yeah, clearly we do. How many more people are we going to let die before we realize, no, there is some serious inadequacy, ineptitude, and some serious biases as to what departments get to live?
Jazz, do you have anything to add to that?
What Reagan managed to do with the Great Society programs is an exact example of that sort of judo I was talking about earlier in the episode, where programs that helped middle-class white people, helped lift so many elderly people out of poverty.
Yeah.
What the Great Society managed to do to alleviate elderly poverty was nothing short of incredible, if we're being honest. And to gut all of that simply because, oh, well, some welfare queens might be getting something that they don't deserve is utterly ridiculous.
Talk to him. Talk to him, Jazz.
As we see today, though, this is the playbook. Oh, well, everyone in the federal government is a DEI hire. Okay, well, then why are planes falling from the sky?
One of the unfortunately beautiful things about history is you can see how poorly some of these things were executed the first time. But the unfortunate part about it is now we can see the iteration, the improvement. Reagan truly only did what Nixon had started. And Donald Trump is unfortunately perfecting what Reagan iterated on.
Absolutely. Project 2025, coming to a city near you. And with that, dear listener, we have come to the end of this episode of the podcast. The easiest way to support the podcast is by leaving us a 5-star review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can follow Gemma on Blue Sky or by visiting her website at gemmaanderson.com. Jazz is exclusively on Blue Sky at jazzpomegranate.bluesky.social. And you can find me, DaPurpleSharpie, on Blue Sky or my website at sharpiepls.com. The official podcast art was designed by sillymeowmax.bluesky.social, and our jazzy intro/outro music was composed by Gemma Anderson. Did you have an idea for a new book we should cover? Shoot us a message on Blue Sky at totesrad.bluesky.social and use the hashtag TotesRadPodcast. Until next time, dear listener, keep thinking. It'll help you one day.